The nature of human life is that the new tends to replace the old. We're also obsessed with having the latest technology that we throw away old phones and laptops even though they still work perfectly well. Sometimes we even do the same thing with entire buildings and towns. There are some stunning abandoned locations, artifacts, and objects scattered across our planet, and we've tracked down some of the most spectacular of them in this video. Testing large military weapons is a dangerous process, and should be conducted as far away from built-up areas as possible. That's why the Soviet Union chose to do it in the water. That's why they built this testing facility in the water off the coast of Kaspiysk in Dagestan. Here, the USSR tested a wide range of experimental missiles and torpedoes in secrecy. The massive 50-foot-tall facility covers an area of more than 15,000 square feet and included crew quarters for military personnel who were permanently stationed there to work on the tests. It's thought that it became abandoned at some point during the 1960s, when the expense of maintaining the station began to exceed the benefits of continuing to perform the tests. Ever since then, it's been left to the mercy of the Caspian Sea, which is breaking it apart a piece at a time. It will eventually crumble altogether and collapse into the waves. In the meantime, it's still off-limits to visitors. Although, we imagine that visiting it in its dilapidated state would be dangerous anyway. At first glance, you might think that Hearthstone Castle is a medieval ruin in the English countryside, but it's actually a long way from England. Instead, you'll find it in the woods of Danbury, Connecticut, USA. It's not even as old as it looks. Although it was built according to the principles of medieval architecture, the castle was designed by New York-based photographer E. Starr Sanford in 1896. He didn't live here permanently, but used it as his summer retreat. Sanford's enormous property includes 9 bedrooms, a grand library, a ballroom, and even a billiard room. The stone used in the construction project is local, but the notoriously fussy photographer had all of the wood specially imported from Italy. Sanford decided he no longer needed the castle after only 5 years in 1902, and sold it on to a new owner, who sold it on again in 1918 to Charles Darling Parks. It was he who gave it the name Hearthstone, because of the 8 stone fireplaces that Sanford included in his design. The castle stayed in the Parks family until 1985, when it was acquired by the city of Danbury. It's been empty ever since and has unfortunately become a target for vandalism. Few things make for a sadder sight than an abandoned theme park, especially one that used to be as beautiful as the Ho Tuy Tien water park in Vietnam. Some of its beauty still remains today, even though it's been over a decade since it was open to the public. In fact, parts of the park still appear almost pristine. That's because big mistakes were made with the opening of the park, and it didn't stay open for long after opening its doors in 2004. The park's owners made the regrettable choice to open the park before it was finished. When the first visitors arrived, the only things that were open were the Dragon Aquarium and a handful of the smaller rides. The dragon sculpture, complete with exotic fish inside glass tanks in its torso, and surrounded by a moat full of live crocodiles, was a spectacular sight. However, it wasn't enough to keep the paying public entertained, or persuade them that they were getting a fair return on their entrance fee. Word of mouth that the park was a letdown spread quickly, and by the time the rest of the rides opened, it was too late. The park closed in 2008 and has now been overrun by nature. Communist nations are sometimes accused of creating dull, brutalist monuments. The Bulza Monument in Kazalnak, Bulgaria, might be abandoned today, but it can't be accused of being a boring monument. Bulgaria isn't a communist nation today, but back in 1974, it was an extension of the Soviet bloc. The ruling Communist Party decided it needed a suitably grand headquarters in 1974, and the Bulza Monument is what they came up with. The flying saucer-like design was eye-catching even back then, and today, It's an even bigger curiosity because of the decay that exists around and within it. The site of the monument was specifically chosen because local communist hero Dimitar Blagov stood on this hill in 1891 and convinced a large audience that communism was the right choice for Bulgaria's future. When the building was still in use, it had a large stained glass red window, complete with the logo of the CCCP, but that was deliberately smashed after the fall of communism in Bulgaria in 1989. The building was attacked and looted several times in the years that followed, so little of value remains within its walls today. The site of the enormous Tera Rouge facility in Luxembourg has become an accidental monument to the country's former steel manufacturing industry. The name Tera Rouge translates into English as Red Earth, which is a reference to the way that iron ore has given the area a distinctively red hue. The seam of iron ore that was once exploited here was very close to the surface, which made it easy to mine and led to a whole town growing up around the factory. Although smaller facilities appeared in the 1830s, the Tera Rouge factory commenced operations during the 1870s. Within 10 years, it had started producing steel, leading to a steel manufacturing boom and an explosive period of growth that lasted until the 1970s. That decade saw the steel industry in Luxembourg collapse suddenly, with almost no accessible ore left in the area. The machinery inside the plant was dismantled and sold overseas, and the factory was closed by 1979. No further use for the facility could ever be found, and so it remains empty. For a place that's been deserted for more than 40 years, it's in remarkably good condition. The name Church of Decay sounds like it ought to be the title of an album by a heavy metal band, but it's also a real place in Liege, Belgium. Of course, that isn't the name it had when it opened. When the first church was built on this site during the 12th century, it was called Église Saint-Pierre. Various churches were built and demolished on the site over the centuries that followed, but the original Romanesque tower was always preserved. The current incarnation of the church, built in the neoclassical style, was finished in 1756, and then extended to cope with a growing population in 1895. The extension proved to be a mistake. Dry rot set in quickly in the newly built rooms and then extended to the rest of the church. A restoration project in 1972 was thought to have permanently solved the problem. But then an earthquake struck in 1983 and damaged the church badly. It partially reopened after the disaster, but had to be closed because of safety concerns in 1999. It's remained closed ever since then, and the dry rot problem has returned, earning the church its nickname. Tropicana Pool in the Dutch city of Rotterdam used to be the de facto place to go if you were in the city in search of entertainment or leisure. Aside from a huge swimming pool, Tropicana also had a sauna, a wild water river, and even a nightclub that opened during the evenings. The nightclub was probably a little bit on the warm side, especially on a busy night, but it also had palm trees and tropical scenery you wouldn't find anywhere else in the Netherlands. Unfortunately, the combination of nightclub visitors and a swimming pool led to sanitation and hygiene problems. An inspection by city officials in 2007 identified a whole slew of problems, most of which involved the cleanliness of the pool. After being forced to pay a heavy fine, the resort's owners decided that the costs of fixing the problems exceeded the value they'd gained from doing so. They declared bankruptcy and the city took ownership. It was briefly used as a greenhouse, but more recently, the cellars have been used to grow mushrooms. The old swimming pool and nightclub above those cellars are entirely abandoned. The Cementa Ficiopenti cement factory in Alzano Lombardo, Italy, was once so busy that it was the single biggest employer of people in the entire town. Those days are long ago and far away now. The factory opened in 1878 under the control of the Pezzenti brothers, who came from one of the country's wealthiest industrial families. The location of the plant next to the Sario River and the Morleo Canal was specifically chosen to ensure that the factory had a constant supply of much-needed water for industrial cement processing. The factory survived the First World War unscathed and was producing 60 tons of cement per day by 1939. But the outbreak of the Second World War forced its temporary closure. It eventually recovered to become the highest supplier of Portland cement in the world. But times were changing. A more modern factory was built nearby during the 1960s, resulting in the obsolescence and closure of Cementa Ficiopenti in 1971. Part of it has since been reopened for guided tours, but the majority of it has been abandoned to ruination. Eventually, this massive structure with its cathedral-like halls will crumble away to nothing. Back in 1906, the city authorities in Kiev, Ukraine, decided that trams were the future of transport. They announced plans for trams to run down every major street in the city center and opened the Kiev Electric Transport Plant, a truly enormous production plant. It grew larger and more productive with every passing year, reaching its peak in the 1950s, when it made 2,000 trolley buses in just 10 years. It was still one of the largest production facilities of its kind anywhere in the world, all the way through to its closure in 2006. The initial plan was for the factory to close down for restructuring, but that planned restructuring work never happened. The corridors and rooms are empty, save for the trams that were still inside it when the doors closed for the final time. Some of them are many decades old, but there are also newer trams that were brought here for repair works in the year of the factory's closure and then abandoned. It seems that the city authorities in Kiev today feel very differently to their predecessors, and there's no longer any call for more trams to be built in the city. Building nuclear power stations is an enormously expensive and dangerous exercise. When you've committed hundreds of millions of dollars to the task of making one, it makes little sense to give up when you're 80% of the way to completion. But the Crimean nuclear power plant was abandoned at that stage anyway. Work on the plant began in 1975 with the intention that it would eventually provide power to the entire surrounding peninsula. A companion town named Shulkine was built next to it to house workers and their families. The first reactor was finished by 1986, with work on the second one scheduled to begin when the notorious Chernobyl disaster occurred in April of that year. That forced an urgent review of the project in Crimea, after which it was determined that proceeding any further was too big of a risk because of geological instabilities in the area. The project was formally abandoned in 1987. Since then, the photogenic ruin has been used as a movie filming location and even hosted music festivals in its engine room for 4 consecutive years in the 1990s. Even those years are long gone now, and both the plant and its neighboring town crumble away in silence. The SemiPalatinsk nuclear testing site, also known as the SemiPalatinsk Polygon, is a place that not even the bravest urban explorers wish to visit. The long-forgotten site in Semey, Kazakhstan, was the site of more than 450 nuclear tests between 1949 and 1989, and is still considered hazardous today more than 30 years later. Back when it was an active testing site, it was considered to be such a top-secret facility that it didn't even appear on official maps. 340 of the nuclear tests that occurred here happened underground, but the remainder happened above it and polluted the air. The combined impact of all the nuclear explosions that happened here is 2,500 times greater than the bomb that dropped on Hiroshima. The craters caused by those explosions still mark the land. Scandalously, it seems that the Soviet Union didn't tell the 200,000 people who lived in the area that the tests were happening on their land. It wasn't until Kazakhstan became independent that the full extent of the horrors that happened here came to light. By that point, cancer rates had become astronomically high, and birth defects among the population were common. Both of those undesirable statistics are still high today. If you and your partner were looking to go on a romantic vacation, where would you go? Would you want to go to a sci-fi themed destination in Honshu, Japan called the Spaceship Love Hotel? No? Nobody else did either. That's why it's abandoned. The bizarre hotel includes beds shaped like alien spacecraft and had what's loosely described as an adult dungeon with a Disney theme. How the Disney theme was supposed to fit with the rest of the hotel is open for debate. Most of the bedrooms have mirrors on every wall to ensure that you can see yourself from every angle, and some of them even rotate like a merry-go-round. Seedy hotels, which could be rented by the hour rather than the night, were popular in Japan during the 1970s and 1980s, but attitudes changed after the death of Emperor Hirohito in 1989, after which new ones were banned, and older ones closed down one by one. While the Spaceship Love Hotel is thought to have been closed for more than 20 years, it still looks the same as it did on its final day of operation, right down to the pneumatic tubes by the beds, which allowed you to send cash payments to reception for discreet services. We feel confident when we say there's no hotel on Earth like this one. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and enjoy watching new videos on my channel. Thanks for watching, and see you soon!